A pleasure to meet all at last, and welcome back once again to video games that are totally awesome. So for this instance, I feel like that some entire series that are mostly made for classic gaming systems, including Nintendo and Sega consoles, and sometimes others, might as well be talked about at some point. I have, after all, established a prior history over the years of talking about various retro throwback games, many of which were game compilations that pack in various titles that we have gotten over the last 5 decades. One of which in particular was known as Atari 50th Anniversary Collection, in which that I talked about every single Atari related console, arcade, and even portable game that were ever made. They were all packed into that one title, that one disc, for the PlayStation lineage, as well as Xbox. But of course, one thing about the Atari 50th Anniversary Collection was that it finally brought us the 4th and final installment in the Sword Quest series. A series that had practically been in limbo for 40 years. Sword Quest Air World had finally been brought on, but unfortunately did not quite live up to some expectations. I mean, we could just give it a break. A video game crash occurred in '83, so not much we can do on that part. However, in terms of other classic related games, I feel like that one instance is perhaps something that's more on like Capcom, for instance, and something that I had actually gotten involved with at some point. For this instance, I'd like to take a look at the Capcom series from 1985 to 2021, known as Ghosts and Goblins. So I might as well go ahead and start off no further back than '85, and at least up until the point where, from the arcades, came along the NES version, Ghosts and Goblins, as well as a few other releases that took place on other consoles. There, of course, was a sequel in 1988 known as Ghouls and Ghosts for the Sega Genesis, and then in 1991 there came along Super Ghosts and Goblins. In terms of the overall story, this centers around a knight known by the name of Arthur. This knight in particular, he is daring, brave, and chivalrous as one would normally expect. But he, of course, wasn't just fighting for some princess who unfortunately got kidnapped by the devil himself. No, Arthur was basically going along in a graveyard throwing javelins at ghosts and goblins, as the subtitle itself says. But contrary to what the title itself says, those aren't the only things that you fight against. There's also zombies, ghouls, reapers, skeletons, dragons, ravens, unicorns, red devils, as well as other creatures here and there. A good majority of which were actually centered upon mythology over the last few centuries, and it at least does make sense that for a game that has more of the fantasy run and gun elements to it, it does incorporate as much as it possibly can in terms of enemies to face. For something like Ghosts and Goblins, though, it's worth noting that one big thing about the franchise is that they're very challenging. Every installment, from the very first title to hit the arcades, up until the recent Ghosts and Goblins Resurrected in 2021, they're all incredibly challenging. And I kid you not, even when I gone through Ghosts and Goblins Resurrected, it still was insanely hard. Of course, with the Resurrected, it does give you a few things to help, including a bit of a progression system, which did allow for you to gain some new powers, some new abilities. Some stats might be boosted, and you can also take a few extra hits. But generally, unlike with the original, the Resurrected version does give you 4 hits at maximum. And from the upgrades that you can put together, there are some times where you might get hit more than that before dying. And that's probably one of the biggest handicaps about the franchise themselves. If we're talking about really hard games that Nintendo's made over the years, there's a few good examples. Contra, Mega Man, Castlevania, Ninja Gaiden, and that's just to name a few. Some Street Fighter games and Mortal Kombat games have also proven to be challenging over the years, but none so much as when you compare to some of the other games that Nintendo's been well known for. And it's safe to say that with some long-running franchises that we've gotten from them, we do know that with Ghosts and Goblins, they'll be here to stay for a good long time. And Tokuro Fujiwara, the main game designer responsible for the original series, and of course is also the same guy responsible for the designs of many other games over the years. Almost every single Mega Man and Mega Man X game were made under his name, and almost a lot of other titles out there, especially Capcom ones, like Bionic Commando for instance, were all made possible because of his design. And he was probably considered to be an auteur game designer of that particular generation. Both in the arcades and console ports, Ghosts and Goblins, alongside many other well-known classics by Capcom, certainly have made a lot of people entertained over the years. But the real thing about Ghosts and Goblins is that the sheer frustration is there in order to keep you up and running on your toes at all times. And also to ensure that you never give up. From throwing javelins, to throwing knives, to throwing flames, to using axes, and eventually grabbing hold of a shield, which is apparently necessary in the NES version to take out the final boss, the devil. But then of course, one big surprise would come along. After you beat the final boss, the devil, there apparently comes a little message stating that, apparently, it's just an illusion. And it sends you all the way back to the beginning to play through from square one. Yeah. Beating the devil twice in a row apparently is how you beat the game entirely. And then of course there's that somewhat infamous end screen where Arthur and the princess reunite. And it's basically a happy ending, as one would expect. But then of course when Ghouls and Ghosts came around, which is what I'm most familiar with when it comes to the more classic side of the Ghosts and Goblins series, this does take place sometime after the events of the first game, but actually centers upon another character known by the name of Lucifer. Yeah, based on the real demon in mythology over the years. But the Lucifer in this game, the way they designed him, as well as bringing him back in Resurrected in 2021, the fact that he's the final boss in both cases, the true final boss, especially after defeating the likes of the Satans, the devils, and other sort of bosses that come around. There of course are the likes of the unicorns, the dragons, and then of course the flaming phoenixes, just to name a few of the specific bosses entirely. In Resurrected, we might as well go ahead and mention that in addition to finding out on the main stages that take place, from the graveyard to the town to the cliffs and even the tower that leads to the devil himself, there are some instances where branching paths actually appear, and you can take a hold of these paths to your advantage. Sometimes they might get you to these other stages a lot quicker, and sometimes they might take a little while to complete. But sometimes if there happens to be a part in the main stage in which that it gets a little too difficult for you to work with, these other paths in side stages technically can help as a means of boosting your progression. That way, you can have all the points you need, the flames that you gather, in exchange for certain abilities on that tree. But even after all that, it still is really difficult. In fact, I actually could not beat Ghosts and Goblins Resurrected even on my best day. Well, it's safe to say that with some difficult games out there, you just can't really get it done the way you want it. And so, call it quits there. Just as I have done over the years with some other things. If it gets too hard, there's no point in continuing. I feel like that pretty much covers all of the different things when it comes to the Ghosts and Goblins series. Nearly 40 years in total had gone around from the first game to the more recent game. And with some other remasters, ROMs, and whatnot that people have made over the years, whether they're released on consoles or on PC or whatnot, we're certainly going to be having a good blast from the past. And it's not just with Capcom properties either. there's also others that have come over the years. Konami, Sega, Mindscape, and the list goes on. For the Ghosts and Goblins lineage, in terms of my overall experience, I haven't played everything individually, although there of course was Capcom Arcade Stadium and their release of both Ghosts and Goblins and Ghouls and Ghosts in the arcade. So, I could go ahead and confidently say that in both cases, they are rather challenging. They have some unique merits, including some music, variety of weapons, variety of power-ups, and point systems for arcade scoring, since that was kind of the thing about arcade games back in the day. They were mostly about high score, while console games do seem to be the epiphany of getting from point A to point B instead. Nevertheless though, Ghouls and Ghosts, since I played with that the most, I'll give that the final score first, at around 6.8 out of 10.1. For Ghosts and Goblins, the one that started it all, we'll go ahead and bump it up a bit to 7.2 out of 10.1. And as for Ghosts and Goblins Resurrected, with its variety and functionality, including some ways to help boost your stats and allow for you to get further into the game, I will admit I've gotten way further in that game than I did with the rest. So, for that reason, I'll just go ahead and go all the way up to 8.0 out of 10.1. Kinda, disservicing that I put a 2021 game far above the others. But what choice do I have, really? In that case, though, that's basically all I got to say about the Ghosts and Goblins series. And I certainly will have many more games on the rise as well. Maybe I'll talk a bit about something else that's technically from the past, but is in fact 10 years old as of this year, 2025. So, you'll be seeing that later on. And as always, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, follow me wherever you can find me, and stay on the Hollywood side.